Hello, and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down a fight between myself and Josh Farrat that happened at AGO a few months back. And normally I wouldn't necessarily do a breakdown of this because the fight isn't necessarily all that interesting or all that long. However, there is an interesting set of circumstances behind this one, and that is I have a style breakdown of Josh on the channel already. So I thought it was actually a pretty interesting opportunity to do a breakdown of our fight, considering that this is the first time that we fought at a tournament since I did that breakdown. So we can maybe go back and refer to some of the points that I made in the style breakdown video and talk about whether or not they were accurate, whether or not that was the kind of fencing that I was seeing from Josh this time, and whether or not my adaptations, if I had any, were effective in dealing with his particular style of fencing. So in the video on Josh, I described him as a high pressure, high intensity, and aggressive bind-seeking fencer. And what that essentially means is that he would often come into an exchanges with some kind of opening shot, seek the bind, meaning that he wanted contact between the blades, and then use that contact to get a read on what his opponent was going to do while backing up, and use it to try to outmaneuver them and get the nice parry reposts off of that situation. And based on this first exchange, that's exactly what we see here. Josh comes in with a very intense first action, that Zorn to the head, but it doesn't really look like it's an overcommitment, and it doesn't look like it's one that was necessarily intending to land. What I mean by that is that as he throws it, it lands in my crossguard because I do in fact have to parry it, and you can see that there is a slight moment of hesitation as Josh gets the download on what he thinks I am going to do as a response. Because I have pre-programmed my responses, the second I make that parry, I immediately throw my left spheric to the head, and Josh does a really good job of standing right where he's supposed to be, not over parrying and not overthinking, and throwing his sword directly into its path, at which point he feels contact and then throws a middle how, or I guess a low unterhau, to my lower right side, which is of course the opposite quadrant of where he's just parried, and effectively gets that shot in. And you can see just how difficult it was for me to come out of that situation where I just threw that left spheric and it didn't land, simultaneously move backwards and try to cover my now opposite quadrant from that attack coming in. So a really great 1-2-3 combination, but one that needed to happen and needed to have that initial strong forward action to work off of. If Josh had come forward with a kind of middling aggression, it was entirely possible that I would have been able to continue to back up and get the range and the distance I needed to parry that follow-up cut. But because he had come at me so strong and he had come at me so aggressively, I put myself in that defensive mindset, and he and Josh put himself in that situation where he could pretty much throw whatever he wanted, knowing that it could be as wacky and undefended as it needed to be to try to land, because I was going to have to try to defend. So for this next exchange, we have what I would consider a really good counter to this particular kind of tactic that Josh is showing here. The idea of being aggressive and using binds in order to get dominance in the Krieg is one based on a historical technique known as the Zorn. And the basic idea here is that if every time you come forward, you have to get that bind, you want to really throw a cut. The reason you want to throw a cut is that it crosses a whole lot of different lines, and it ensures that if you throw it correctly, you're going to be able to zone out a whole lot of your own primary targets, making sure that even if they throw at your hands, or maybe even a little bit lower or deeper, that you're probably going to get contact with that blade, which is exactly what you want. A thrust, specifically an onsetsen thrust, which is a thrust as they're moving forward in a kind of interrupting phase, is the perfect counter to this kind of play because, one, every time someone has to throw a cut, they have to start with their blade off center, which means that there is a perfect little opening for that thrust to find. At the exact same time, they have to then cross from that offline to the center line, which means if you structure your thrusts properly, you're going to have your strong and your crossguard in the path of their cuts, which means that you'll not only probably land that thrust as you're coming forward, but you're also going to have your strong in a position to defend you. Now, in this particular case, what happened here is Josh had his blade very offline. It was down by his foot. And the idea here is that the only thing he could really do to cross his line was to throw a very strong unterhau up into the center or try to cut me in the hands. Now, by doing this onsetsen thrust properly, what I also had to make sure of was that the footwork was right. Now, if you watch this exchange, what's happening in the pre-fencing here is that Josh is continually inching forward with his front foot, and that's telling me that he's trying to move forward, so I move backwards. However, the footwork that happens right as I throw my thrust is different. What we see instead is that Josh is sitting right at the edge of range. He's just about to move backwards, but then he decides to try to disguise it by moving his back foot backwards a little bit and then forwards a little bit. And the idea here is that whenever someone moves their back foot forward or backward, you can pretty much guess that their front foot is going to move next. And if you're looking for an opportunity to throw a thrust, especially one where you're trying to interrupt somebody coming forward, throwing that thrust the exact second their back foot moves forward is the perfect opportunity, because now pre-programmed in their brain is this command to go back foot forward, front foot forward. And if you can thrust somebody while their front foot is moving forward, you not only are going to hit them as they're moving into range, maybe a little bit closer than they intend to be, but it also means that their front foot is going to be in the air, or at least not have all the weight on it, which means they are not going to be able to move backwards as effectively. Since, of course, you need your front foot to push backwards in order to move backwards. You can't pull with your back foot. So, as a result, Josh does this little bit of footwork. I interrupt that footwork with my thrust, and I land just on the bib long enough to, get a nice thrust. At the exact same time, Josh comes up with what was probably intending to be a cut to the hands, but because he was interrupted, he didn't really have the game plan set out already, and it comes in a little bit flat. But either way, it's a pretty good demonstration of how you can interrupt somebody who's constantly being aggressive with you, especially if they have to use cuts to get that initial bind. For this next exchange, and I did skip one, you see another great use of tactics from Josh. And there's really two distinct things that happen here. The first is that in the little bit of the pre-fencing when we're going back and forth, Josh feints an attack, and I completely overreact. And it might look a little silly when you watch it from this context, but the idea here is that the reason I react so heavily is because I have gotten already so used to Josh's really strong initiating actions. And this is a really great thing for Josh to have in his back pocket, because if he knows that he can throw a feint and get me to just throw my hands into one quadrant or another, he knows that he can probably effectively come forward with a feint and then throw somewhere else and get a full bite out of me and get a really nice feint attack. However, in this particular case, what he's looking to do is also make sure that I'm second guessing every single block that I throw, because I know that since I reacted so poorly in this instance, he's probably going to be thinking about throwing a feinted attack, and now I'm also going to be second guessing any parry that I throw in the initiating action. All this comes together to form a kind of feedback loop in my mind that's putting me in a situation where I am just thinking entirely about defense on the initial action and not about offense. And for his credit, Josh goes like 3 steps deep and throws that initiating action again, and this time with the intent of just binding with me, because he seems to guess, rightfully, that I'm just going to throw an action straight over the top to try to interrupt him as he's coming forward. And this is the kind of mind games that you get between people who really know how to fence and know how to try to get into each other's minds. We see a bunch of different back and forths where Josh will initiate, I'll throw my hands up in the air like I just don't care, and then we're going to go back and forth trying to metagame what kind of action is coming next. And in this case, it's Josh who guesses accurately. So we both come forward with a strong action, we meet in the middle, and we both get stuck. And this is where Josh's forward momentum and mindfulness in the bind is going to give him a lot of credit, because as soon as this happens, I throw my cheeky little left Sverk, but it's so stuffed that it can't really land on any meaningful targets. It's kind of blocked by the camera, but trust me when I say that throwing a left Sverk from this position so low, almost like a golf swing, into somebody's body is just not going to count, and it's not going to be very good. At which point, Josh realizes that I am too close to throw this left Sverk, just kind of pushes my hands in towards my face a little bit, backs up at a measure, and hits me on the hands, the top of my right side, as he exits the exchange. This is a really smart thing to do, because when you throw a Sverk and it gets stuffed, one of the positions you end up in is a kind of hanging ox position. And from this position, you don't have a lot of range, and your hands are very exposed. So Josh did a great job of attacking the target that he exposed by getting me into this really close grapple and making sure to be able to back out and stay safe, making sure that I couldn't, Svercopter my way to a double. Now, for this next exchange, there are two more things that Josh does really smartly here that really gets in my head. And the first one is that knowing that he is going for the bind, he's going for these big initiating actions, Josh constantly transfers his hands in and out of these really exaggerated guards. He'll go all the way into tail guard on his left side or all the way into high Vomtag up above his head. And honestly, he's not really intending to fight out of any of these positions. What he's trying to get me to do is to inch forward. And what he's essentially doing is by going into these big gestured positions, he says, look, you know exactly what cut I'm going to throw towards the center line. You should come in with that onsets and thrust again. And it's all baits to try to get me to overcommit out of range to targets that I think are available. Now, in this particular case, I don't take the bait, though I think I don't take the bait partially because I'm just so scared of these initiating actions that I don't feel like I want to move forward at all. But the second thing that Josh does really well is that after he sees I'm not taking these baits, he then goes in with another strong initiating action. But the situation that he ends up in is very dissimilar from the ones he's had the couple times before. Rather than throwing my instinctual left Sverk, I try to put myself in a kind of parry repost loop. One thing that happens a lot when people come in with an action is that they'll kind of throw it rather middlingly because they don't really care about landing it. And all they're looking to do is save their momentum and save their tempo for that next parry repost. So the second I feel contact on my guard, I don't do anything. And I wait for Josh to throw his prearranged parry repost. Now, this does mean I have to parry once or twice in a row, but it does often mean that you can get someone to overcommit on the second attack rather than the first one, and it can work out pretty nicely in that way. Though in this particular case, we get another great read from Josh, and as he sees me being way too defensive and parrying 2 times in a row, he realizes that the second attack or the third attack he has to throw has to just be completely unblockable. And he does a really nice thing, which is go for my leg. Now, the leg shot is something that is very risky in the realm of longsword because you generally have to expose all of your upper targets in order to go for it. But if you have your opponent completely against the ropes and you've got them throwing blocks 2-3 times in a row, going for the leg shot is an absolutely perfect opportunity to get a clean shot and exit the exchange. And Josh throws his leg shot with the two-handed version. Now, one thing about the two-handed version of a leg shot is that you do have to be that much closer, but it also means that you don't have to do any kind of wacky footwork or any kind of wacky blade work with one hand on your sword that results in you being very open after the fact. So Josh hits me in the leg, I fail my block, and immediately after, as he's leaving the exchange, I look like I'm going to go for another follow-up attack, but realize he's already too far away and he's already in a defensive posture, and my chances of hitting him are effectively 0. Now, on our next exchange, I know going into this that I still have this onsets and thrust in my back pocket, and it's really my only effective option for dealing with the kind of sweeping center line cuts that Josh is kind of throwing out. However, he's been showing to me that he wants that to happen by going into these exaggerated guards and knowing full well that he is going to throw one of those big sweeping cuts through the center line to try to displace my thrust. But at the end of the day, the only reason I'm ever going to be able to land my onsets and thrusts is if I take the bait. And sometimes throwing out these baited guards can be just as much of a read for me as it is for Josh. So in this particular exchange, Josh is up in a really high left ox, and what that is telling me is that you should either try to A, go for my legs, or B, try to throw that thrust straight down the middle, see what happens. And in this case, I do throw that onsets and thrust. However, I managed to get around the sweeping cut that Josh throws to try to set it off. And the reason I get around it is because I accurately predict exactly which kind of sweeping cut he's going to throw, and I duck under the blade at the right moment and get on the opposite side of that cut, which allows me an unimpeded shot straight at the head. So, in this particular position, up in this high left ox, the cut that Josh is looking to throw is he's looking to turn his hands from facing up and to his left to facing down and to his right, and basically wind, which is what it's called in the books, from that left ox to a left plow or a right plow. And that particular plow is going to determine which side he's going to set my thrust off from. So, I thrust on his inside line, his inner left side. And what that means is he has to wind from his upper left to his lower left to try to zone me out. However, as I am coming forward, I duck from his left side to his right side, meaning that he accidentally chooses the wrong plow to wind into, and as a result, it almost looks like in the slow-mo that he just completely whiffs my blade. No contact is made. And as a result, he has no guard up in place. I manage to stab him in the head, and we throw our little after blows just to make 100% sure that the judges see it. Now, this next exchange is one of the longer ones and probably my favorite of the entire fight, and the reason for that is it demonstrates very nicely how safe you can be on the inside of an exchange when you're just in that really close Zverk range. So what happened in this particular one is that Josh comes forward with another initiating strike. I parry high on my left side, as we've done before, and I throw my left Zverk straight at his head, although I throw it in a slightly different fashion. Most of the time when someone throws a Zverkow, they try to get under the blade of their opponent. This is because it allows them to hit kind of the lower areas that are harder to parry, like the arms and the torso, but also it allows you to end up in that hanging parry position where you can continue to defend. However, when someone just comes in to attack you, chances are they're not going to throw another attack on that same side. So ending up in that hanging parry position isn't always that conducive to defense. At the exact same time, though, if you parry on your high left side and you throw your Zverkow over the top of the blade, you actually end up in a very unique position where you can force somebody to try to guess whether or not they have to keep their blade high or keep their blade low in order to defend that Zverk. And depending on which one they pick, whether or not they end up on the inside or the outside of your blade line, they can end up picking wrong and leaving their head entirely exposed. Now, in this particular case, based on the footage, you can't really see whether or not I land that Zverkow, and honestly, it doesn't really matter if I do. But one thing that is important to note is that Josh does in fact pick the wrong kind of parry for the particular Zverkow that I throw. You can see that as I make the parry and I start to throw my Zverkow, Josh pushes his hands low towards his right arm, and what that means is that that left Zverk that's coming in high above the top of his sword is basically has an unimpeded path straight to his head. But it doesn't really matter because it doesn't seem to land. However, once it doesn't seem to land, Josh does the very smart thing of shoving his hands into my hands in order to stop the follow-up Zverk, and then throws a cheeky little left Zverk of his own. As he's throwing his own left Zverk, we kind of open up a situation where I have to come around and throw a right Zverk that really also doesn't intend on landing, but just needs to protect my head. And this is a great instance of counter Zverking, where you're not really looking to try to do anything as far as aggression. You're just trying to throw a Zverkow so that you can effectively transfer your hands from the left side of your body to the right side of your body and end up in that right hanger position that's so defensively oriented. I manage to make it in time, I get in under it, and I manage to parry the back of my head, at which point I have to turn out of it, step out of range, and we reset. However, we reset all the way on the side of the ring. So our options are a little bit limited. And what happens yet again is Josh comes forward with another really good advancing strike. I parry, I counterattack once again, and this particular time we get a really nice left Zverkow into a separation that looks really, really fancy. But one thing about it that's really critical is all the things that happened before it show that every single time we came together and through this whole like left Zverk parry repost combination, we put in those little bits of variation that tried to stuff what we saw as the instinctual response from our opponent. So we got about 3 layers deep into the counter Zverkow game before one of us ended up coming up with a point. It's a really cool exchange, and one that if you ever want to watch what kind of like high level Zverkow gameplay looks like, this is exactly a perfect demonstration. So this is the final exchange of the fight, and it's another one where I try to pull out the Onsetsun card, but it's another one where we see Josh really effectively use these clearing cuts to push one of my thrusts out of the way, and it's on the first exchange. So we see a similar sort of footwork situation. Josh is inching forward. I'm waiting for that feeling or that instance where he moves one of his feet, and then I can interrupt and throw my thrust so that, I know exactly what the other foot is going to be doing. Chances are not attacking me. And in this particular case, Josh does a really great job of bailing out of his forward momentum a little bit and throwing that Zorn across the middle and setting my thrust right off. And you see immediately why this was such a good game plan from the beginning. Because once he gets that, he gets me in such an absolutely awful position that he's able to throw 2 cuts back to back without me being able to do anything other than defend. Now, theoretically, I could have just tried to hit him and doubled it out, but this was a tournament where 3 doubles would result in like a loss or bad points for the next thing, something really bad. So it did put the incentive in my brain that I had to parry both of these rather than just try to do anything else. And lucky for me, I too managed to get both parries, despite the fact that they were on opposite sides of my body. So I get the parries, I throw a little response cut as I leave, but it's not very good, and we end up getting to reset. And once again, I go in for the onsetsen, but this time I have a very different target than the chest or the head of my opponent. I go for the hands. And one of the great things about shooting a thrust for the hands is that if you can land it, you can get an uninterrupted path straight to your target that all the sweeping cuts in the world will never defend. Because the great thing about using a cut to defend a thrust is that if you can throw that cut straight across the major targets of your body, you can pretty much guess that you're going to make contact with the blade at some point. But if you throw a thrust at the hands, you can't cut in front of your own hands. There's really no cut that does that except maybe certain kinds of Krumphaus. But the idea here is that because I throw this thrust straight to the hands and it managed to get a really deep bury in there, I not only land that thrust, but I also put myself in a situation where I have pressure on my opponent's hands that I can use to feel where they're going, and most importantly, to try to slow it down or stop the response cut that's coming. Because, of course, every time you stab low, whether it's to the hands or to the belly, you don't really have any defenses up. Your head and your upper chest are all completely exposed. And in this particular case, I got a little bit lucky that Josh, upon feeling himself getting stabbed in the hands, goes for a cut to my hands rather than just bopping me in the top of the head. However, at the end of the day, my stop thrust to the hands counted, and I ended up winning this fight. But it's another really great instance where sometimes fights where the scorecard doesn't necessarily reflect how close things were can still be really great fights to break down and watch, especially when it comes to the kinds of tactics that certain people employ. Josh has a really unique way of fencing that you don't get to interact with a lot during tournaments. So if you're ever fencing someone like him and you want to know how to deal with this or what kinds of things you might be looking forward to, this is a great video to watch. But also, if you're trying to fence like Josh, which I don't think many people do, this is a lot of great tactics that you can use to try to effectively bolster your own offensive capabilities in order to score some really key points in tournaments in the future. But if you don't think that's accurate at all, feel free to write down in the comments. I'm sure Josh will be there telling me that I don't really know how he fences at all because I haven't seen all the tricks he has yet. But hopefully I'll get to fight him in the future and I'll see the rest of those tricks. But in the meantime, I will see you guys next week.